Well, welcome back, everybody. We hope you had a good lunch. We are very glad that you are interested in the funding from GCC's Crime Victim Services Committee. And we will go ahead and get started. We have a lot of information to cover. We'll be talking about the VOCA, Victim Assistance and VAWA STOP funding priorities for this upcoming cycle. Wanted to introduce you to our planning team. It includes myself, Sandy Dixon, and Grace Clougherty, our program assistant, Lindsay Bohan, Jordan Meyer on the VOCA team, and Dawn Brown-Hairston and Amanda Endicott on the VAWA team. So the Crime Victim Services Committee's mission is to advocate for victims by promoting the development of effective programs that improve the response of human service professionals and the criminal justice system to crime victims. So how do we develop our funding priorities? First, we get input from staff. We get certain information, as our executive director was saying earlier this morning, to try to estimate the upcoming federal award amounts. We look at the prior priorities historically and applications and amounts of those applications. We also look at the historical performance information that we get about prior projects and agencies, and then do research from the field and discuss with other states what projects and programs they're seeing as being productive and helpful. And we are in particular looking at the GCC Crime Victims Needs Assessment and have begun analyzing that and seeing how we can integrate those into our funding priorities. We also have two groups, the CVS Advisory Group and the VAWA Implementation Work Group. This is input from across the state, from victim service providers, and they talk to us a lot about innovations in their fields. We then bring all this information to the CVS committee. They review this information and they make final recommendations to be voted on by the commission. So important factors for our 2025 process is going to be the amount of federal funds that we have estimated to be available. VAWA STOP is estimated to be very similar to 2024. We don't anticipate any major changes there. It's what Caroline alluded to this morning or discussed this morning about VOCA victim assistance. And right now we are estimating that amount to be anywhere between $3 million and $30 million. This is making it extremely difficult to plan for. And so you'll hear a little bit more about that as we move forward. So I wanted to talk about some important items for 2025. Projects are no longer allowed to roll their year one surplus funds from year one into the next year. With those lovely organization documents, we do have that section now built in EBS, and they will all need uploaded to the project. Your organization documents are the documents that apply to the entire organization. And this way you do not have to upload them to multiple different applications. So in your project, you will attach only those attachments that are specific to that application. We have a big change for 2025 for our competitive applications. The application period of performance will be for 3 years. So for VOCA, the POP, period of performance, is moving from 2 years to 3 years. And for VAWA, it will move from 1 year to 3 years. So each budget year will have to be submitted annually, and each subsequent budget year will be added through a continuation budget, depending on how much federal funding that we have. So as a result, your second and third years may be increased, decreased, or stay about the same. So for this application, you will only enter your year one budget lines. We also wanted to highlight for you in our RFA, you will see a scoring matrix. This will help you understand how the committee will be scoring your applications. And so we just wanted to point that out to you here. And without further ado, I will transition over to Lindsay and her team.
Good afternoon once again, everybody. Yeah, we're going to go through some of the specifics for the 2025 award cycle for VOCA, or the Victims of Crime Act Victim Assistance Funding. So I think one thing to highlight, even though we continue to have stressful / roller coaster of emotions as it comes to VOCA funding and what that looks like from year to year, is that the Victim Assistance Fund is hitting its 40-year, did hit its 40-year anniversary this year. So just wanted to just highlight that in particular. And so also highlighting the goal of the VOCA Victim Assistance Funding, which is to improve the treatment of victims of crime by providing victims with the assistance, support, and services necessary to aid their restoration and healing after a criminal act. And so for those who are not super familiar with the kind of beginnings of the Victims of Crime Act, it was put in place through federal legislation in 1984. So services under this grant program that was created are defined as those efforts that do one or all of four things. So responding to the emotional and physical needs of crime victims, assist primary and secondary victims of crime to stabilize their lives after victimization, assist victims to understand and participate in the criminal justice system if they so choose, and then provide victims of crime with a measure of safety and security as appropriate to their victimization. So there's a couple of pieces underneath VOCA that are federally mandated. In particular, there is a handful of federally mandated allocations that we as the state administering agency have to meet when decisions are being made around awarding these grant funds and how they are awarded and who they are awarded to. So these minimum allocations are reflected here, and we've provided some definitions of kind of what is in each of the categories, but it is 10% of the overall award must go to, at a minimum, must go to sexual assault programs or projects, applications. 10% also must go to domestic and family violence. 10% of the funding also has to go to child abuse, and then 10% goes to the underserved category. And in this instance, we have utilized what we refer to as our basic services funds or our block grants to meet the 10%, the sexual assault, domestic and family violence, and the 10% child abuse allocations. And then we have historically utilized the competitive application category to meet, and 9 times out of 10 pretty drastically exceed the 10% in the underserved category because of the need that we know that is out there and is being applied for during these processes. Go to the next. So there are, of course, a handful of requirements that go into ensuring that you are able to apply for VOCA funds. So agencies must be able to demonstrate a record of effective services by having a history of providing direct services. So we don't necessarily dictate how long that history needs to be, but there does need to be, we don't award new agencies who cannot provide, who have not had a history of in some form or fashion providing direct services already prior to applying for VOCA funding. So agencies also must provide documentation of substantial financial support from sources other than the Crime Victims Fund or VOCA funding. So this one is a little bit harder because we know that this work is seemingly kind of always at a deficit in regards to the level of funding that is available and accessible to folks. But we do look at the ability to sustain the project and sustain your agency without VOCA funding and how it would impact were we to provide you funding and the sustainability of being able to utilize those funds effectively. We do look at new victim services organizations, newer victim services organizations, but they do have to show that they have the capacity with at least 25% of the agency's funds coming from other sources. So this can be other federal funds, because GCC is not the state administering agency for every single federal fund that is out there. There's a lot of OVC grants, Office of Victims of Crime. There's a lot of other federal grants that go directly to agencies and can be applied for and don't need to come through a state administering agency like GCC. So you have the ability to also apply for those funds. And so you might also be receiving some of those funds in addition to, or you might also be receiving more than just VOCA funds from GCC. There, we have a lot of subrecipients who also utilize VAWA funding. There's some overlap with juvenile justice and less overlap with criminal justice improvement. But we look at that of other federal funds that you're receiving. Also, you may be provided state funds, whether it's for agencies like Council for Women and Youth Involvement, if you are an eligible agency to receive their state funding, whether it's through DHHS, other state level funding that you might have. So non-federal funding support also is of course looked at, as well as it is also able to be used towards the match requirement, either in donations and funds raised that way, either through in-kind or cash. So as Sandy alluded to and was discussing initially, there have been, as we've seen over the last few years for folks who have received VOCA funding, there have been substantial fluctuations. There have been substantial decreases in fact, and that has heavily impacted not only the number of awards that we can give out, but the amount that we are able to award, and the amount of priorities we are able to award from year to year. So typically we have them split into our non-competitive or our basic funds, which I touched on very briefly in the allocations. And then we also look at our competitive funds, which we have a cycle yearly as a result of competitive funding amounts that we receive through VOCA. So under the non-competitive basics, it is based on formulas, based on a geographic and population-based formula for counties being covered, both through the domestic violence services, through sexual assault services, and through CACs who are either provisionally or fully accredited. So that is, like I said, based on a formula that we are able to get and determine what their allocation is for each year, or for each year that they apply. So we have, once again, the domestic violence and sexual assault victim service agencies. Some are solo DV agencies, some are solo sexual assault agencies, and others are dual agencies. So we have that category combined. And these are designated agencies only. So if you don't know if you are a designated agency, if you don't know that you are you already received funds and are working with Council for Women or Youth Involvement as a domestic violence or sexual assault agency, or you're not already working with CACs in North Carolina for your provisional or full accreditation, then you can always ask us, but I would definitely refer you to those agencies to request and or ask that information, because majority of the agencies who apply under this will have already been advised and are already aware of that they are designated as a basic grant under these services and can apply for this money. So, and then to highlight for this cycle specifically, for the 2025 cycle, all of our current basic grants, so all of the grants that are currently active and who will either end 9/30/2025 due to being currently active, or will end 9/30/2025 because they just received an extension, they will actually be extended an additional year. And that will be a later process that we'll move through. But they'll be extended for an additional year and do not need to be applying for the 2025 cycle that we are posting, and that is beginning December 1st. So we will go through the process with all of those agencies to be able to end on 9/30/2026. We will also notify you of what your allocation is going to be once we have a better understanding of what our actual state allocation is going to be, because we are looking at that 3 to 30 million at the moment, which is very up in the air. And the committee has to make a determination of what, if any, cuts are going to be made. And then the only basic grants under our DV, SA, or CAC designated agencies that will be applying for this cycle will be agencies that do not have any current grant funding with us and that were just recently designated in the past 2024-2025 cycle. So if we have not already been in communication with you about a grant award application, then you shouldn't be an agency that would be applying at this time. I think we only have one, maybe two agencies at this time that would actually be reapplying, or actually, excuse me, applying for the first time ever under the non-competitive category. And then as far as the competitive side of things, because the fluctuation and because our understanding of where we are at with our with the 2025 award for VOCA is so drastic, we worked with the committee and with the commission, and they made a determination of what our competitive cycle was going to look like based on the worst case scenario. So looking at our worst case scenario of $3.5 million for 2025, how could we ensure that we were able to have a competitive cycle? So because the underserved crime victim priority is mandatory, a mandatory allocation, that is the only competitive application priority that we will be accepting for VOCA for the 2025 cycle, which I know is going to be a lot for folks to take in. So we'll move through this. So application submission limits. So overall, agencies have to submit no more than one competitive application per program priority. Typically, we have multiple program priorities under the competitive banner and under the competitive cycle. However, this time we are only operating with one program priority, and you can only submit one competitive application per implementing agency to be considered for funding. Additional applications, of course, will not be considered. So if you are an agency that you submit to underserved applications, we will contact you and we will ask you to choose which one you want to move forward with, because we will not be able to move forward with more than one per implementing agency. And this is not inclusive of any of the domestic violence, sexual assault, or CAC basic services. That cap isn't. So it's only one in addition to which active grants that you have in regards to your basic services grants. It's only one competitive application are you limited to. So caps wise, there have been caps in place since 2023, and they are still in place for each for the one priority that we have, for the one competitive priority that we're going to have this cycle. And then you must apply for no more than that cap amount, which means that if you previously applied for less than that cap amount, you can apply for up to that cap. But it cannot be over that cap amount. And we'll go a little bit more into that a little bit further as we move on, because I'm seeing some questions in the chat about what that looks like. So awards under the VOCA program will be made for a funding period not to exceed 3 years per funded project. And then, like Sandy advised, each budget year will be applied for annually. So you will only be applying with a year one budget, even though the period of performance for the award, if you are awarded, will be for 3 years. Again, the following priority categories are funded to designated agencies only. So the sexual assault and domestic violence victim services, that program priority, when it's applied for, they are in it is one program priority. So it is not separated out as sexual assault program priority and domestic violence victim services priority, due to the fact that we have some agencies that are dual service agencies. So any agencies that are designated under this, whether they're designated for sexual assault, domestic violence, or both, would apply under that priority. So, but in this instance, only if you don't have an active grant. If you do not receive notification from GCC establishing that you should receive a basic services funding allocation, then you are not eligible to apply for funding in these priority categories. And I mean the non-competitive priority categories. You can apply in the competitives. You cannot apply for the non-competitive priorities unless you have already been informed that you are eligible. And then once again, highlighting that all basic grants that are currently active will not reapply this year. So once again, you'll be getting a second extension for the next federal fiscal year the time that we have the allocation determined. And yeah, once again, same, just overall, these are the folks who are going to apply in 2025 will be the 1 or 2 agencies that we have who do not currently have an active application or active grant in our system in EBS at the moment. As I said, I think we only have maybe 1 or 2 agencies that will actually actively apply under these two priorities. So even if you see it active when you open it up, like Kevin showed, even if you see it as an active priority, unless you've already been designated, unless you already know, unless we've already reached out to you, you should not be applying under this priority. And then but typically they are submitted and address the needs of victims of sexual assault or domestic and intimate partner violence by providing direct services to victims of crime in their designated counties. Proposals should include a plan of action to provide core crisis intervention services to victims. I won't list through all of them, but just as some examples that you can refer back to, this is just a list of services that we typically see budgeted under these non-competitive grants, and they are looked at as, you know, core pieces, fundamental service elements of providing direct services and supportive services to sexual assault and domestic violence victims. So including client outreach services, crisis line operations, shelter and transitional housing services, legal assistance, and items that are not fully included in this, but within this scope. So for the child advocacy centers, they are proposals that describe services provided by a fully or provisionally accredited child advocacy center. Each organization also has to upload a verification letter from the Children's Advocacy Centers of North Carolina that states their accreditation status. So for the child advocacy centers, the proposals for these non-competitive grants, they include costs to cover direct services personnel for the following services. So advocacy, evidence-based mental health services, child medical evaluation, forensic interviews, and forensic medical evidence collection exams. These are the specific scope under which the proposals are going to be submitted for CACs. Okay, so I know what everybody wants to hear is the specifics around the underserved competitive priority, since this is the only competitive application priority that we are accepting this cycle. So these priorities were voted and confirmed as the recommendation by the Governor's Crime Commission after receiving the recommendations from the Crime Victim Services Committee. So these are not decisions that are made solely by GCC staff. These decisions are made by the CVS committee and by the Governor's Crime Commission in conjunction with our advisory group, which was referred to earlier. So once again, the verbiage VOCA requires a minimum of 10% funding that is allocated to projects serving previously underserved populations of victims of violent crime. So underserved populations may be distinguished by crime type or by demographic characterizations. They're actually allowed to be distinguished by one or the other or both. But for the Governor's Crime Commission, for GCC, for this application cycle, we will be accepting applications under this priority for under crime type or under demographic characterizations. So you should look to develop and or continue implementing programs that address underserved crime victim groups by providing an array of direct services. And then we want to just make sure that we highlight that we're highly encouraging culturally specific agencies to apply under this priority, as well as agencies who are able to meaningfully address the needs of victims of crime under these crime types and populations, including but not limited to having personnel that reflects the communities served within this priority. So the specifics under what crime types and what demographic types we will accept applications for this cycle. So one, just specifying again that only one application in the underserved priority is allowed. An example, an agency cannot apply for underserved for human trafficking victims, and then also apply for another application with underserved victims who are LGBTQIA. So that cannot be two applications. And then, so you would select the region that you fit within in regards to your cap and the area that you're going to be providing services to, either local, regional, or statewide. And then you are going to select one of the crime types listed here, or you are going to select up to 3 of the demographic type or special population types that are listed below as well. If you are primarily serving a crime type, or if you are primarily serving a demographic type that is not listed here, you will not be applying under this cycle. So just a list of allowable activities. So proposals may include costs for direct service personnel, volunteers, and services and goods needed for support direct services prorated to the portion of the project that it is covering. And we have this list of allowable direct services included, which includes a lot of what we previously went over in the non-competitives, but very, very heavy on services that, one, are direct services and that we see as fundamental service elements of effective direct service programs for victims of crime. I think unallowable activities is actually a really important piece of things, because if your application has a majority of unallowable activities listed, it is likely that it won't pass preliminary review when we review it. So lobbying and advocacy with respect to legislation or administrative changes to regulations or administrative policy is not allowed to be billed, budgeted, listed as an activity that can be reimbursed under VOCA. Research and studies, except for project evaluation within the limits established by GCC, cannot be allocated to VOCA funding. Active investigation and prosecution of criminal activities, except for the provision of victim assistance services to crime victims, cannot be billed and cannot be allocated as a budget line item to VOCA if you were to be awarded these funds. And nor can fundraising activities be, they are not allowable as well. And then capital expenses, including capital improvements, so property losses and expenses, real estate purchases, mortgage payments, and construction are all unallowable activities under VOCA grants. Again, reimbursement of crime victims for expenses incurred because of a crime. So except as otherwise allowed by other provisions herein. So medical care, except as otherwise allowed. Salaries and expenses of management, board members, and other administrators except as specifically allowed, which is usually tied to direct services or support of direct services. And then trinkets that are promotional in nature, that do not include information about direct services or not being utilized for victims of crime directly, that would be utilized for conferences or that would be utilized for giveaways. Those are all going to be unallowable to be a budget line item in VOCA grants. So once again, in regards to the required documentation, we really want y'all to always look through your RFA. A lot of the questions that you're going to have are going to be answered in the document. We understand that it's long. We understand that some of it can be cumbersome to figure out, especially if you're new to applying for these grants. So we are absolutely always available to do that. But there has been a significant reduction over time in the documentation that is required in your application at the time of submission. So we make sure to list everything as clearly as possible. And so VOCA specific project documents are listed in our RFA, as well as the organization documents that Kevin and Sandy also referred to. And then samples of most of these attachments and also the templates for a lot of the required forms are going to be on our forms, is going to be on the website under GCC forms in the application or award sections. And the last thing of significance is going to be, or one of the biggest things of significance, including what we've kind of already reviewed, is going to be our match requirement for these applications. So we have, GCC has policy that we advise as a notice of unique circumstances, which allows for us to make a determination. Well, and not by us, I do not mean us, I mean GCC's executive director. That's not a decision that we make. The executive director determines that a unique circumstance exists that warrants the waiver of a match for all applications submitted during this grant cycle. Previously, that has been as a result of COVID, the onset of COVID. Then it was the onset of the VOCA fix, which mandated a universal match waiver. But then now we have a policy that takes into account, the unique circumstances and hardships and barriers that the executive director, Caroline Farmer, has determined is being met this cycle. So all applications submitted under this grant cycle for VOCA will have their match requirement waived. And I probably took too long, so my apologies. But if you have any questions or concerns, I'll go through the chat as well, because I know folks have been answering a lot of these. And then we'll go ahead and turn it over to Dawn for our VAWA presentation.
Thank you, Lindsay Bohan. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dawn Brown. I am the lead VAWA planner at the Governor's Crime Commission. I'm a member of the Crime Victim Services team, and we appreciate you all spending time with us today. I am going to present the Violence Against Women Act program for you. So the GCC VAWA programs consist of Sexual Assault Services Formula Program and the STOP program. Our Sexual Assault Services Formula grant is currently passed through to our Sexual Assault Coalition, and they administer the funds on a separate cycle. Our STOP funds, or our STOP program, is the Violence Against Women's Formula Grant Program. It's awarded to states and territories. It enhances the capacity of local communities to develop and strengthen effective law enforcement and prosecution strategies to combat violent crimes against women, and to develop and strengthen victim services in cases involving crimes against women. So 2 programs are managed under VAWA. Today, we're going to talk a lot about STOP, again, because our SAS funds are passed through. So those are not awarded on a competitive cycle. I'll give you a little background about the STOP program. The Violence Against Women's Act of 1994 was passed by Congress and created the Office of Violence Against Women in the United States Department of Justice. So since its inception, OVW has supported a multifaceted approach to responding to crimes against women through the implementation of grant programs authorized by VAWA. I did add some information here, as you've heard several times in the workshop today. Our workshops will be posted for you, so these links will work. If you go in and pull up this presentation, you'll be able to click on the link and learn more about OVW programs, the STOP program, the SAS program. You'll learn more about performance measures and some recent reports to Congress on the effectiveness of the VAWA programs. So let's talk about our application. STOP stands for Services, Training, Officers, and Prosecutors. So in this program, we wanted to, again, a coordinated multidisciplinary approach to improving the criminal justice system's response to violent crimes against women. So we want to focus on services, the training of officers and prosecutors, and these grants are meant to help and provide victims with the protection and services they need to pursue safe and healthy lives while improving communities' capacity to hold offenders accountable for their crimes. Okay, so in the VAWA Stop funding priorities, I want to let you know that everything that you'll see described in the RFA with regards to stop priorities have been supported by the North Carolina Governor's Office. Our priorities encourage programs that involve partnerships, collaborations, and best practices that meet the need of crime victims and others across the state. We encourage applicants to develop projects that support victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking by ensuring that the stigma of reporting is no longer a barrier for victims. We want to provide resources for trainings to help law enforcement better understand victims and ultimately reduce any stigmas surrounding reporting. And then we also encourage you to develop projects that utilize best practices and/or evidence-based interventions. So the first thing you'll want to do is identify your stop priority service areas. Funding is restricted to the developing and strengthening of effective law enforcement and prosecution strategies. So we want to develop and strengthen those services as well as victim services. We want to focus on domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. Those are the specific crimes that STOP funds support. Human trafficking victims who have also been sexually assaulted or battered by an intimate partner can be served with STOP funds as well. So the first thing you'll want to do is choose for your application one priority service area for your project. So that would be the victim services category, the law enforcement category, prosecutors, state and local courts, and discretionary. Next, you will want to identify if your proposed project plans to serve one of the two STOP focus areas. Okay, this is not mandatory, but while you're thinking of your project and getting all the components ready to submit or input your data, you want to think about these two things. Is your project a sexual assault project? Sexual assault projects must have a sole and legitimate focus on sexual assault. So if you are planning to provide services for domestic violence and sexual assault, that would not be considered sexual assault. But if the services are specific and solely focused on sexual assault, you would want to select that category. Our next focus area would be that of the culturally specific. And these projects must be focused on working with racial and ethnic minorities. And examples of that are listed for you in your RFA, as well as restrictions with regards to what designates an agency to be culturally specific. There's also documentation that you will see required in the RFA that identifies you as a culturally specific organization. So those are our two STOP focus areas. And then third, you would want to review the purpose areas. So for your application, throughout your application, you must meet one or more of the VAWA statutory purpose areas. GCC has identified 13 purpose areas that align with the state of North Carolina's VAWA implementation plan and that fill in funding and service gaps for the state. So Sandy mentioned early on that we have committees and advisory groups. So our STOP advisory group, we meet 4 times a year quarterly, and we focus on the STOP implementation plan, ensuring that we are aware of the needs in our state and we're aware of how we can use STOP funds to support those needs. And so we have developed a STOP implementation plan that holds our 13 purpose areas. Your STOP applications should be consistent with these 13 purpose areas. You'll see them mentioned in the RFA. They're going to be lettered A through M. But also you'll be able to go to our website and access the STOP implementation plan. That's very, very important. You can find it under committees, and under VAWA, you will see the VAWA STOP implementation plan for 2022 to 2025. We are in the process of updating that plan, so a new one will come out in 2026. But for the applications that you're working on and that we're discussing in this workshop, you will need to review this implementation plan because we want to make sure that applications are consistent. All right, so again, this workshop will be available to you. You'll be able to access the link to our website. And, you know, if you have any issues, we make ourselves available so you can contact us to make sure you get to that information. You'll need to identify in your application at least one of those purposed areas. So that is a very, very important part. We can go over our STOP priorities now. Our first STOP priority is the state and local court priority. 5% of our STOP application is allocated to this category. This is a non-competitive category, so designated agencies are only eligible to apply, and those agencies will be notified by the Governor's Crime Commission of the amounts to which they should apply. Funds in this category are allocated to support courts and their continued effort to ensure access to legal remedies and protections for victims and to strengthen the court's collaborative role in enhancing community safety. Our next category is victim services. That is our most competitive category. We allocate 35% of our STOP funds to victim services. Your applications will be capped at $200,000 and they're scheduled to go for 1 to 3 years. Funding in this category, funds are allocated to support a range of services directly to victims that assist them and their families in navigating the criminal justice system and the aftermath of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. And some examples include providing information and support, helping victims navigate the criminal justice process, providing counseling services, crisis intervention, or culturally specific services. All of these examples and more are mentioned in your RFA to assist you. And our next category is law enforcement. So for law enforcement and prosecution, both of those categories, we allocate 25% of our award. We're required to. So our caps are very similar or pretty much the same for both of these categories. We are capping direct services at $100,000 for projects that have 2 or less employees. For 2 or more employees, those projects are capped at $150,000. For training projects, we have capped those at $55,000 for regional and $200,000 for statewide. And we've also included in our priorities a concentration or a focus on domestic violence, firearm homicide reduction. So we are capping programs or projects that address domestic violence, firearm homicide reduction, excuse me. We're capping those at $100,000 for both law enforcement and prosecution. And finally, our discretionary category has been allocated 10% of our STOP award. Domestic violence intervention programs are a major part of our discretionary category. We are capping these programs at $55,000 for regional and $100,000 for programs that support or propose to expand and serve multiple regions. We also have prevention and emerging issues that we want to address in the discretionary category as well. And here is where we will address prevention programs that'll be capped at $55,000, and domestic violence, firearm homicide reduction programs that'll be capped at $100,000. And agencies requesting funding for domestic violence intervention projects are required to submit a letter from the North Carolina Council for Women and Youth Involvement supporting the justification for the expansion to multiple regions. All right, so also our STOP program has a 25% match requirement. So projects that are, applicants, nonprofit organizations are not required to submit a match, but our state organizations are required. So state or local government agencies under or applying for VAWA STOP will be required a 25% match. Next, we can talk about some VAWA specific documentation. You will see in the RFA lots of requirements. And I have gotten phone calls, emails, and some comments or questions in our last workshop regarding confidentiality, regarding VAWA specific documents. So we did make this slide just to make sure that VAWA folks fully understand the documentation that you are required to provide. So confidentiality assurances will be for victim services only providers. Law enforcement and prosecutors are not covered by the confidentiality. So in these categories, we look for and encourage the use of best practices, policies, and processes that protect victims' privacy. If you are a law enforcement or prosecution provider. Culturally specific organizations will have to submit verification. And so there are documentation, there's documentation information within the RFA explaining that stipulation. Legal services organizations and prosecutors are responsible for submitting our legal services certification. Prosecutors and legal services and law enforcement applicants will be responsible for submitting assurance concerning polygraph testing prohibition. And finally, our domestic violence intervention programs, as you heard me state in the previous slide, you're responsible for submitting a certification and or letter of support from the North Carolina Council for Women and Youth Involvement if you are a domestic violence intervention program. All right, that concludes my presentation today. I hope I provided the information that you need to successfully apply for STOP funds. If you have questions in the chat, I will review them and try to answer them. And please contact me or my team members if you think of additional questions. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Dawn and Lindsay. Great presentations and a lot of good information. So we have 12:56. I will stop sharing and allow for the next group to take over.